Kyle Seltarian had always been a minor, easily overlooked figure in the sprawling virtual reality game Mythic Beast Defense. He was the youngest son of the powerful and prestigious Seltarian noble family, a name that carried weight in the game's world. However, despite the family's prominence, Kyle's role had always been insignificant. In the early stages of the game, Kyle Seltarian appeared in a few key story events, but his fate was sealed from the beginning. He was meant to die, a weak character defeated in a single blow by a minion of the main antagonist. His death had always marked him as nothing more than a disposable side character, easily forgotten by players as they moved on to more important quests and challenges. But now, Kyle Seltarian was no longer just that side character, he had somehow become the protagonist. Standing in front of a mirror, Kyle couldn't believe what was happening. The face staring back at him was one he recognized from the game, a face he had always pitied. Kyle Seltarian's face. Utterly confused and in disbelief, he pinched his cheek hard, trying to wake up from what he was certain had to be a dream. A sharp pain shot through his face, confirming that this was all real. It wasn't a dream or a hallucination. He was actually in Kyle Seltarian's body. Staring into the mirror, he felt a wave of panic wash over him. He shouted how this was possible, his mind racing. He was supposed to be Lee Hyun-woo, the #1 ranked player in the world of Mythic Beast Defense, not this weak, doomed character. How had this happened? Why was he now trapped inside the body of one of the game's most pathetic figures? Mythic Beast Defense was no ordinary game. Released in 2030, it had quickly taken the world by storm. The game was notorious for its brutal difficulty, and even after 10 years, not a single player had managed to beat it. Yet, its punishing mechanics only seemed to increase its popularity. Players were addicted to the endless challenges it presented, and the global ranking system was fiercely competitive. Completing quests, acquiring rare items, and unlocking hidden missions gave players a chance to climb the rankings. But most people barely survived in the game, let alone thrived. Lee Han-woo, however, had not only survived, he had thrived. For a decade, he had devoted himself entirely to Mythic Beast Defense, mastering every aspect of the game. From the intricate workings of rare magic circles to crafting legendary items, he knew it all. His skill, strategy, and determination had earned him the coveted title of the top-ranked player in the world, a position he had held for years. But now, none of that mattered. Lee Han-woo was gone, and in his place was Kyle Seltarian, a character who was never meant to live long enough to see the game's later stages. Kyle knew exactly what was going to happen to him because he had played through this part of the game countless times. In the original storyline, Kyle Seltarian was destined to die early on, cut down without much resistance. His role had always been to serve as a minor narrative device, a brief plot point in the grander story. But now, that story had changed. Kyle wasn't just a player anymore, he was inside the game itself, living through the eyes of a character he had once ignored. The question that haunted him was simple but terrifying: how was he going to survive in this world when even the most powerful protagonists struggled to beat the game? Kyle's fate had always been to die. But now, trapped inside his body, he would have to find a way to rewrite that fate and navigate the deadly challenges that lay ahead. The ultimate objective in Mythical Beast of the Winds was clear: to halt the advancing forces of darkness. But what made the story even more twisted was the fact that the one who summoned these dark forces was none other than Adolf, the second son of the Seltarian noble family. Adolf, consumed by his ambition to take control of the family's leadership, made a dark and fateful choice. He turned to the forbidden power of darkness and sparked a rebellion that would shatter the Seltarian family's rule. As a result, the once proud territory of the Seltarians became a stronghold for the forces of darkness, creatures and entities that had long coveted the lands of humanity. And amidst all this chaos, there was Kyle, the weakest, most powerless member of the family, who stood no chance. He was effortlessly killed, a mere casualty in the unfolding disaster. Now lying on his bed, Kyle, the real one who had been transported into the game, couldn't help but wonder if his best course of action was simply to flee the Seltarian territory before Adolf's rebellion even began. After all, the future looked bleak, and getting out before the chaos erupted seemed like the only way to survive. But Kyle knew there was a much bigger, more immediate issue weighing down on him, a problem he couldn't ignore. He was afflicted with Hermemiu. Hermemiu was no ordinary disease. It was a debilitating condition that caused the mana channels in one's body to become blocked. In this world, mana wasn't just a source of magical power, it was life itself. Mana was the very energy that sustained everything, from physical strength to the ability to wield aura and magic. Without mana, one's body would wither away, deprived of the nutrients needed for survival. For people like Kyle, whose mana channels were blocked, Hermemiu was a death sentence. Most people diagnosed with the disease didn't live to see their 20th birthday. Kyle had been diagnosed with Hermemu at a young age, and from that moment, his life had spiraled into despair. He had tried to absorb mana from nature, which was the only way to cure the condition, but with his blocked mana channels, this was impossible. It was as if fate had already written his death. The fear of death haunted him every day, gnawing away at his willpower, while the knowledge of how little time he had left him tormented. His anger simmered deep within him, fueled by the frustration of being unable to do anything, unable to fight back, to live freely, or to change his own destiny. This endless feeling of helplessness twisted his mind, driving him into a state of rage and mental torment. Soon, Kyle became nothing more than a burden to his family, a source of shame that they could no longer ignore. Eventually, Kyle's father, the head of the Salterian family, had enough. Ashamed of his youngest son's state, he confined Kyle to a small, isolated side house, far from the family's mansion and the eyes of the world. He was convinced that everyone saw him as nothing more than a joke, a pitiful failure who was destined to be forgotten. His heart pounded in his chest as the overwhelming sense of injustice and humiliation consumed him. His hands trembled with anger as he stared at the floor with disgust. Suddenly, in a fit of rage, Kyle grabbed the nearest object, a wooden chair, and hurled it with all his might at the wall. The chair shattered on impact, splintering into pieces as the echo of the crash reverberated throughout the small room. But even that wasn't enough to satisfy his fury. He cursed, his voice filled with venom and desperation. He wanted everyone to disappear. He wanted the world to burn for what it had done to him. At that moment, it was clear Kyle had reached his breaking point. He could no longer contain the hatred and hopelessness that had festered inside him for so long. Even in the game, Lee Hein-woo, the player who had controlled this world, had regarded Kyle as a lost cause, a character with no future, no hope. Now, as Kyle glanced around the dimly lit room, surrounded by the wreckage of his outburst, he couldn't shake the thought that he was completely ruined. Not even the terminal illness that was slowly killing him could stir any sympathy from those around him. To the world, Kyle Salterian was nothing more than a forgotten failure. Attempting to regain some control, Kyle forced himself to assess the situation, only to be hit with a harsh truth. He was trapped in the body of Kyle Salterian, the youngest son of a noble family on the verge of collapse. With no talent for swordsmanship or magic, a terminal illness cutting his life short, a dreadful personality, a stained reputation, and imprisonment by his own family, Kyle realized there was no escape. No matter what he did, whether he stayed or fled, death awaited him in this world. He was stuck in a situation without hope, with no way out. In his frustration, Kyle raised his voice to the ceiling, furious at his predicament. He wondered how he could possibly survive with such poor stats. Wasn't there supposed to be some kind of cheat ability or advantage that came with reincarnation? Something like a status window or special skill? Suddenly, a light flickered into existence behind him. Kyle spun around, startled to see glowing rings hovering in the air. Confused, he hesitated for a moment before reaching out, curiosity overriding his caution. He had never seen anything like this before. The second his hand touched one of the rings, it exploded into a burst of radiant light, leaving him stunned as the sensation washed over him. Out of nowhere, a system notification appeared, declaring that he had awakened. He had been granted 2 new talents. The status window was now unlocked, and his insight skill was automatically activated. Kyle stood there, shocked, as the long-awaited status window materialized before him. He eagerly inspected it, excitement growing as he realized that one of the talents he had gained was called Mana Pathways. While he knew that the insight skill allowed him to view detailed stats, Mana Pathways was something unfamiliar, something he had never encountered before. Puzzled, he considered the name. It had to be related to magic, that much was clear. Kyle remembered that the most sought-after magical talent was Mana Mastery, but something told him this was even more extraordinary. A spark of hope ignited within him. This might just be a top-tier talent, one that could change everything. For the first time since entering this world, Kyle began to believe that no one could stop him now. With newfound confidence, he reached for another ring. As it entered his hand, the energy surged through his veins, spreading like wildfire. He was stunned, feeling the raw power coursing through him, but then his hand froze mid-motion. Looking down, he noticed something. Hermu, the cursed affliction that had plagued him his entire life, blocking the flow of the mana pathways. Kyle commanded the mana to move according to his will. Closing his eyes, he directed it to push through the blockages caused by Hermemu. The mana responded to his command, and as he shaped it into a drill, it followed, slowly penetrating the obstruction within his body. He focused intently, guiding the mana, and after what felt like a lifetime, he succeeded in breaking through Hermemu. Excitement surged through him as he realized it had worked. The mana began to flow freely, though it only reached up to his elbow. Kyle knew that by continuing to gather mana and expanding the pathways, he could finally overcome the curse of Hermemu. Relief washed over him. For the first time, the fear of death no longer hung over him like a shadow. The next morning, in the kitchen, The maid Ursiel was busy preparing a meal, feeling satisfied with the dish she had just completed. She picked it up, thinking she should bring it to Kyle quickly before it got cold. However, a group of other maids appeared, their expressions cold and stern. They ordered her not to deliver the meal to young Master Kyle. Ursiel looked at them, confused, as she saw the anger in their eyes. One of the maids, Hai, stepped forward and explained that they had decided to stop serving Kyle for a while as a protest against his behavior. She added that after a few days of hunger, Kyle might reconsider his attitude. She then commanded Ursiel to put the food down. The other maid nodded in agreement, supporting Hai's decision. Despite the aggressive commands thrown at her, Ursiel remained calm. She stated with quiet composure that they could do whatever they wished, but she would continue her duties. Her defiance infuriated Hai, who sneered, questioning if Ursiel truly believed she was the only one acting with honor. In a sudden fit of rage, Hai knocked the tray from Ursiel's hands, sending the carefully prepared meal crashing to the floor. The sound echoed through the room as food scattered across the ground. Ursiel stood frozen, her eyes wide with shock as she stared at the mess. Her heart raced, but Hai wasn't finished. With a voice dripping in venom, Hai mocked her, spitting insults as she reminded Ursiel of her family's disgraceful fall that had led her into servitude. But Ursiel, determined to keep her composure, said nothing. Instead, she quietly bent down to pick up the pieces of the broken tray, her hands steady despite the turmoil within. Hai's anger only deepened at Ursiel's silence. She yelled in frustration, her voice trembling with fury as she demanded to know how Ursiel dared act so superior. But Ursiel remained focused, carefully gathering the fallen plates. Her refusal to engage only provoked Hai further, and without warning, she raised her hand, preparing to slap Ursiel. Hai's hand hung in the air as she screamed at her, demanding an answer. Before the blow could land, a deep voice cut through the tense atmosphere, startling everyone in the room. Hai and the other maids turned quickly, their attention shifting to Leonhardt, who stood in the doorway, his sharp gaze assessing the scene before him. The room fell silent as his presence commanded the attention of everyone present. Leonhardt's eyes scanned the room, moving from the spilled food to the shattered tray in Ursiel's hands. His gaze lingered on Hai for a moment before returning to the mess on the floor. As understanding dawned on his face, he calmly noted that the meal had been meant for Kyle. His voice was firm and authoritative as he instructed Ursiel to prepare another meal immediately and take it to him. Ursiel blinked, momentarily taken aback by the sudden directive, but she quickly regained her composure. She nodded in acknowledgement of the command, her voice soft but firm as she responded with a simple, respectful affirmation. Meanwhile, Hai and the other maids, who had previously acted with such boldness, now shrank back, clearly subdued by the weight of Leonhardt's authority. Without offering any resistance, Ursiel turned back to her duties, now moving with a heightened sense of urgency. As she prepared the meal, Leonhardt remained in the room, silently observing her actions. The kitchen, once brimming with tension and hostility, gradually quieted. The earlier conflict seemed to dissipate, leaving behind a heavy, lingering silence that filled the space. In his room, Kyle sat deep in thought, carefully examining the talents he now possessed: insight and mana mastery. He pondered over the possibility that, with these two abilities, he could change the course of the fallen Celtirian family's fate. After all, Kyle had spent 10 years playing Mythical Beast Chronicle, so the knowledge he had accumulated felt like prophecy. Moreover, being born into a powerful and wealthy family like the Celtirians gave him an edge. This realization sparked a flicker of hope within him. Perhaps it wasn't impossible to stop the encroaching forces of darkness. With newfound determination, Kyle began to formulate a plan, deciding to focus on 3 primary goals. First, he would clear his blocked mana pathways and overcome the barrier of Hermemu. Second, he would dedicate himself to learning magic. Given that mana pathways specialized in magic, it made more sense for him to become a mage rather than a knight. Third, he would prevent the collapse of the Marquis family. The stronger the family, the greater the benefits for him. The Celtirian family was renowned for its reputation, skill, and wealth. This would serve as a crucial shield for Kyle, especially since their territory was located on the outskirts, far removed from the political chaos of the capital. Most importantly, Kyle knew that he needed to gather talents to prepare for the major assault by the dark forces in the coming years. He was fully aware that he would need powerful allies to survive. Using the ability of insight, Kyle decided that he would seek out individuals with potential and turn them into loyal allies. He was confident that by building his strength, survival was a certainty. As he considered how to start gathering talent, he thought it wise to begin with finding a spy. And since he was already in the Celtirian family, Leonhardt seemed like a strong candidate, a reliable NPC tank in the game. Just as Kyle's turbulent thoughts were spiraling deeper, a sudden knock at the door broke through the chaos. Ursiel stepped into the room, announcing that she had brought his meal. Kyle stared at her, blinking in confusion. He struggled to place her, his mind drawing a blank as he attempted to recall her name. Before he could fully gather his thoughts, the system kicked into gear and his insight talent activated. A notification flashed before his eyes, informing him that the target in front of him was of low rank. To Kyle's astonishment, a status window materialized in the air, revealing Ursiel's detailed information. His eyes widened as he realized that the insight ability now allowed him to view other people's stats and characteristics in remarkable detail. It was a revelation, and he began to understand the vast potential of his newfound abilities. Kyle glanced at the window that appeared in front of him, revealing the details of the maid, Ursiel. She was 12 years old, with the talent Eternal Companion of Spirits and a proficiency in household chores. Her listed traits were calm and hardworking, and her favorability level with Kyle was at 30. But what truly shocked Kyle was the talent she possessed. Eternal Companion of Spirits was a high-rank summoning talent, the kind that could lead to someone becoming a legendary summoner. Without even realizing it, Kyle had moved dangerously close to her, only snapping back to reality when Ursiel looked at him, her expression polite yet detached. She respectfully suggested that he enjoy his meal, and Kyle, still shaken, merely muttered a confused sure in response. As Ursiel left the room, Kyle couldn't help but wonder how someone with the potential to become a genius summoner was working as a simple maid in this place. His mind raced with questions. How had such a powerful talent gone unnoticed? Kyle's thoughts drifted back to a year ago when he had attended an auction. The host of the event had greeted the crowd, promising them a rare and unique item, something they wouldn't find anywhere else. The atmosphere had been electric, filled with anticipation. Kyle had been there, watching from the back. Then, the auctioneer introduced the next item, a girl, the third daughter of the fallen Baron Helheim, Ursiel. The crowd had been shocked. The auctioneer had emphasized her noble upbringing, though it was clear her family had fallen from grace. Despite her background, he remarked that she was poised and intelligent, inviting the bidders to begin. The initial price had been set at 50 gold coins, and the bids quickly escalated 70, then 90, and continuing upward. Kyle sat beside Leonhardt, who had quietly suggested they leave, remarking that slave auctions were beneath them and not worth their attention. Yet Kyle remained silent. Then, to everyone's surprise, he raised his hand and offered an astounding 300 gold coins for Ursiel. The room went dead quiet, with both Leonhardt and the auctioneer staring at him in shock. After a moment of disbelief, the auctioneer announced the bid and asked if anyone would go higher. Leonhardt was in utter disbelief. He leaned in toward Kyle, urgently whispering, questioning if he was really planning to buy a slave and what his father would think of such a reckless choice. Annoyed, Kyle snapped at him, sharply telling him to stop lecturing. He declared that he had the right to spend his money however he wished, adding that his father didn't care about his decisions anyway. When the auctioneer finally declared Ursiel sold for 300 gold coins, Kyle stood abruptly and walked toward the stage. Removing his mask as he approached, he leaned down to meet Ursiel's eyes. With a firm and confident tone, he told her that from that moment on, she belonged to him. After the auction, Kyle removed Ursiel's shackles and informed her that she was no longer a slave, free to go wherever she desired. His words left her speechless, hesitating as he turned to leave. Confused, she reminded him that he had just claimed her as his own. This caught Kyle off guard. She quickly ran to catch up, grabbing his coat and insisting that she would follow him. Kyle looked at her for a moment, then sighed, telling her she could do whatever she wanted. Reflecting on this first encounter with Ursiel, Kyle realized that this memory belonged to Kyle Celtirion, the original one. He now understood that Ursiel had ended up as a servant in the Marquise's household because Kyle had saved her from being sold into slavery after her family's downfall. This realization gave him a deeper understanding of the hardships she had faced at such a young age. He also found himself becoming more intertwined with Kyle Celtirion's emotions and memories, even feeling the sense of helplessness and abandonment the original Kyle had experienced in relation to her fate. His train of thought was interrupted when he tasted the meal Ursiel had brought him. Surprised by how good it was, he asked if she had prepared it herself. Ursiel, caught off guard, immediately checked if something was wrong. Kyle offered her a warm smile, reassuring her that the food was delicious and complimenting her cooking skills. He even requested that she continue making his meals from then on. Though flustered by the praise, Ursiel agreed to his request. Shortly after, the system flashed a message Ursiel's affection for Kyle had increased by 35 points. Kyle found himself reflecting that, considering the intense nature of their initial meeting, this level of affection wasn't particularly remarkable. Yet, given Kyle's past rebellious behavior, the fact that she held any positive feelings toward him at all was almost unbelievable. He recalled that in Fantasy Defense there was never a character named Ursiel with soul magic abilities, leading him to suspect that she might have died during the Marquise family's internal conflict long before her potential could emerge. Resolute in his decision not to let such a valuable talent go to waste, Kyle vowed that this time things would be different. Turning to Ursiel, Kyle asked her if she had ever considered learning soul magic, hinting that he sensed a natural talent in her. Ursule was left speechless, having never entertained the thought of possessing such a gift. From her surprised reaction, Kyle quickly deduced that her family had probably never introduced her to soul magic and that she had likely remained unaware of her own potential. Soul magic was known to be an incredibly expensive field of study. For a lower-ranked noble family like Ursule's, affording such education was far beyond their means. Kyle made up his mind to train her himself and instructed her to start thinking about studying soul magic. Though she hesitated at first, Kyle made it clear that she had no choice in the matter. He stepped closer and explained that she needed to follow his guidance because she was now his responsibility. Ursule, shocked by his seriousness, stared at him for a moment, her face gradually turning red from embarrassment. The system chimed in once more. Her affection level had risen to 50. Finally, she nodded in agreement, accepting his direction. A few days later, Kyle found himself confronting Leonhardt as he attempted to leave his room. Irritated, he demanded that Leonhardt move aside, insisting he wanted to go outside. However, Leonhardt, as composed as ever, denied the request, reminding Kyle that he was not allowed to leave without the master's approval. Kyle's irritation quickly turned into anger, and he snapped, questioning whether he was supposed to remain locked away forever. Remaining unruffled, Leonhardt calmly reiterated the master's orders, pointedly asking if Kyle had forgotten the reason for his confinement. The harsh reminder sent a shiver down Kyle's spine, forcing him to recall that it was his own rebellious actions that had led Marquis Celtirion to lock him away in the first place. Yet Kyle knew he didn't have much time left. As he looked around the room, he could see the faint mana particles floating in the air. He realized he needed to act soon. Ever since discovering that he could open his mana pathways, Kyle had been absorbing the mana in his room daily. Although it wasn't enough to unlock all his mana channels at once, like the first day, the mana gradually accumulated in his body, like experience points in a game, slowly improving his condition. But it still wasn't enough to completely cure his Hermemiu. This meant he needed to get outside to gather more mana. With a faint smile, Kyle told Leonhardt that he wasn't planning to go far, just a short walk to stretch his legs. Leonhardt seemed surprised by the excuse, remarking that this was the first time Kyle had ever given such a reason. The comment irritated Kyle, prompting him to snap, asking why Leonhardt thought that way about him. Leonhardt replied, his voice steady, saying that as Kyle's bodyguard for many years, this was the first time he had heard Kyle mention anything about exercise or taking care of himself. Kyle quickly realized how low his reputation had sunk. His credibility was practically non-existent. He found himself wondering how Leonhardt, of all people, had become such an immovable wall. It seemed reasoning with him was going to be almost impossible. In the game Fantasy Defense, Leonhardt was a renowned character, praised for his outstanding abilities in both defense and offense, with tremendous growth potential. He could be developed into a captain-level knight and was often used as a tank character in teams. Players loved him for his unwavering loyalty, knowing that in the original game, he would never betray them. After the fall of the Marquis family, Leonhardt became a battle-hardened knight that players could recruit. Since the rebellion led by the second son had yet to take place, Leonhardt remained stationed at the Celtirion estate. Kyle found it almost absurd that someone as capable as Leonhardt was being tasked with guarding a rebellious nobody like him. He couldn't help but wonder what the rest of the Celtirion Knight Squad was occupied with. Eventually, Kyle couldn't hold back his curiosity and asked Leonhardt why he was still here, a question that took the knight by surprise and visibly annoyed him. Leonhardt, his expression hardening, asked Kyle directly if he had a problem with him serving as his bodyguard. A surge of panic washed over Kyle as he saw Leonhardt's affection points plummet by 60. In a rush, Kyle attempted to explain that he didn't have any personal issues with Leonhardt, but he found it difficult to admit that Leonhardt was far too skilled for such a trivial role. Leonhardt's reply was measured as he explained that he was simply following his master's orders. This sparked a wave of irritation in Kyle as he realized Leonhardt's allegiance was not to him, but to his father, Remton Celtirion. Kyle sneered internally at the thought, questioning why anyone would remain loyal to a disgraced rebel like himself, but deep down, Kyle knew he couldn't allow things to stay this way. Determined, Kyle told Leonhardt that he needed to persuade his father. Something in Kyle's voice gave Leonhardt pause, as if sensing a shift in the young man's resolve. Kyle, meanwhile, smiled inwardly, knowing he had caught Leonhardt's interest. Confident that he could win him over, Kyle asked if Leonhardt would help convince his father, already viewing Leonhardt as the second key recruit in his growing plan. Leonhardt noticed a noticeable change in Kyle's attitude and immediately grew suspicious, questioning what Kyle might be up to. With a slight grin, Kyle played innocent, asking what Leonhardt meant by plotting. It quickly became obvious, though, that Leonhardt held no trust in him whatsoever. Recognizing this, Kyle let out a heavy sigh and tried to offer an explanation. He told Leonhardt that being confined for so long had given him time to reflect and change his outlook. Leonhardt, still doubtful, pushed for a clearer answer. Kyle responded with a confident smile, revealing that he had made up his mind he wanted to live longer. This revelation left Leonhardt utterly speechless. The Kyle he knew, the one who had seemed to accept his fate due to the incurable Hermemu disease, was now talking about extending his life. It was almost impossible to comprehend. Not long ago, Kyle's father, Remton Celtirion, had privately told Leonhardt about Kyle's bleak future, expressing his belief that Kyle wouldn't survive past 20 years old. Kyle lacked magical talent, was poor at swordsmanship, and as the youngest son, he had no real prospect of inheriting the family's legacy. Despite all these obstacles, Remton had insisted that Leonhardt stay close to Kyle, even though his future seemed so uncertain. At the time, Leonhardt had hesitated when Remton asked if he resented being tasked with such a role. But after a brief pause, Leonhardt had answered truthfully, saying it was an honor to protect a direct descendant of the Marquis family. He had vowed to carry out his duties with loyalty and dedication. Remton, visibly touched by his words, had explained that there was no one else in the entire family he trusted more than Leonhardt to protect Kyle. With a heavy heart, Remton had pleaded with Leonhardt to look after his son. After some internal debate, Leonhardt had bowed his head in agreement. Now, hearing Kyle talk about wanting to live longer and asking for permission to go outside for exercise, Leonhardt couldn't help but be taken aback. This wasn't the same Kyle he had been sworn to protect. Kyle, sensing the opportunity, suggested that Leonhardt discuss the matter with his father, confident that Remton would understand his request. Then, directly, Kyle asked if Leonhardt would allow him to go outside. But Leonhardt, loyal as ever, stepped in front of Kyle, firmly blocking his path. He remained resolute, insisting that Kyle could exercise indoors. His tone was final, leaving no room for argument. Kyle, growing increasingly frustrated, ran his fingers through his hair in agitation, silently cursing how unyielding Leonhardt was turning out to be. Realizing that politeness would get him nowhere, Kyle's demeanor shifted abruptly. His voice hardened as he issued a direct command, making it clear that he wouldn't repeat himself. He ordered Leonhardt to move aside, his frustration simmering as he thought about how vital it was for him to get outside to gather more mana cores. He met Leonhardt's eyes with unwavering intensity, letting the weight of his willpower bear down on his loyal guard. Leonhardt sensed it, the undeniable change in Kyle. He could feel the shift in his aura, something was different now, but even in the face of this new intensity, Leonhardt's loyalty held strong. He would not step back. With a measured step, he approached Kyle, his own formidable presence filling the space between them. His tone remained calm but firm as he reminded Kyle of the absolute nature of his father's orders. They applied to Kyle just as they did to anyone else. If Kyle truly wanted to go outside, he would have to get past Leonhardt. Kyle could feel the oppressive weight of Leonhardt's killing intent bearing down on him. Instinctively, he stepped back, surprised by the intensity of Leonhardt's power, used merely to stop him from leaving the house. He quickly realized that if he had been an ordinary 13-year-old, he might have been paralyzed with fear or even collapsed under the pressure. But instead, Kyle smiled to himself, knowing full well that he was far from ordinary. He locked eyes with Leonhardt and, with a calm and measured tone, reminded the knight to keep his promise. Leonhardt's brow furrowed in confusion, unsure of what Kyle meant. Kyle, unbothered, stepped forward, placing a hand gently on Leonhardt's shoulder, a gesture that startled the knight. Without a word, Kyle confidently walked past him. Leonhardt, still standing with his aura crackling around him, watched in disbelief as Kyle casually strode past, seemingly unaffected. Kyle turned back, his expression serene but firm. He asked Leonhardt how it felt, pointing out that he had in fact passed him without resistance. There was a quiet sense of victory in his words. Then, without hesitation, Kyle stepped outside, taking a deep breath as the fresh night air filled his lungs. He stretched his arms above his head, enjoying the newfound freedom. A smile crept across his face as he marveled at how long it had been since he had last stepped outside. Though it was merely the small garden near the annex, it felt like a world of endless possibility to him. He gazed up at the night sky, wondering if it had always been this breathtaking, or if his confinement had made him appreciate it more. Excitement surged through him as he spotted mana particles scattered throughout the air, sparkling like stars. Unable to contain himself, Kyle darted toward them, eager to absorb the energy. He could almost feel his strength growing with every step. Meanwhile, Leonhardt stood watching, silently observing Kyle's uncharacteristic joy at simply being outdoors. He couldn't help but think to himself that despite everything, Kyle was still just a child. Yet, even as he reflected on that, Leonhardt was troubled, replaying the moment in his mind when Kyle had calmly walked past him. The knight felt a deep sense of confusion. He knew that Kyle had never been trained in mana manipulation or aura control, and yet somehow he had withstood the weight of Leonhardt's killing intent. As Kyle gathered the mana particles, he glanced back at Leonhardt, noticing the knight's perplexed expression. He could guess what was going through Leonhardt's mind, his disbelief at what had transpired. And Kyle knew Leonhardt had every reason to feel that way. Outwardly, Kyle appeared to be nothing more than a 13-year-old noble who had never seen real battle, but mentally, he was something else entirely. Kyle had lived through 10 years of brutal virtual warfare in the game Fantasy Defense, surviving countless skirmishes and facing death more times than he could count. The game had been infamous for its realism in simulating combat, and Kyle had become numb to the terror of life or death situations, bloodshed, and the horrors of war. Enduring Leonhardt's killing intent was as natural to him as breathing. For Kyle, Leonhardt's intimidation was no more than a distant memory of the battles he had fought and survived, and now he was ready to face much more than just a knight's aura. After gathering enough mana particles, Kyle felt that he was on the verge of unlocking more mana pathways. Just as he finished, Leonhardt approached him, stating that he would request a punishment from Remten for his actions. Confused, Kyle asked what he meant. Leonhardt explained that although he had followed Remten's orders, directing his killing intent towards someone he was supposed to protect was a grave mistake, and he would seek punishment for himself. Kyle, trying to reassure him, told Leonhardt that it wasn't necessary. However, if Leonhardt insisted on reporting to his father, Kyle asked him to add that he did not wish for Leonhardt to be punished. True to his word, Leonhardt reported everything to Remten, who was taken aback by Kyle's unusual request. Remten asked if it was true that Kyle had specifically requested no punishment for his subordinate. Leonhardt confirmed this, stating that Kyle's words were indeed sincere. Remten clarified that it wasn't that he distrusted Leonhardt, it was just hard to believe. Leonhardt admitted that even he had difficulty comprehending it. He explained that when Kyle calmly faced his killing intent without flinching, he doubted what he was seeing. Remten pondered deeply, trying to make sense of how Kyle, a boy who had never shown any particular strength or aptitude, could withstand the killing intent of a knight as powerful and experienced as Leonhardt. It didn't add up in his mind. His curiosity grew and he questioned Leonhardt further, wanting to know exactly what Kyle had done after that strange confrontation in the garden. Leonhardt paused for a moment, reflecting on the scene he had witnessed. He recalled the stillness of the air, the cold breeze that had swept through the garden, and the gentle sound of water flowing nearby. Kyle had been sitting there in complete silence, meditating, his posture calm and composed. With this vivid memory fresh in his mind, Leonhardt responded to Remten, explaining that after their encounter, Kyle had simply sat down to meditate. Remten processed the information slowly, his expression thoughtful. He tried to piece together what this meditation could mean. Was there something deeper at play? How had Kyle, a boy who had once seemed so lost and helpless, suddenly gained this mysterious composure? Remten continued to ponder, now even more intrigued by the changes in his son, unsure of what to make of them but certain that something significant had shifted. Leonhardt slowly approached Kyle, offering a compliment on his ability to meditate. Kyle responded calmly, explaining that his father had taught him a bit of swordsmanship when he was younger, and during that time, he had also learned the basics of meditation. However, Kyle admitted that he had given up not long after, realizing he had no talent in that area. He then instructed Leonhardt to ensure that no one disturbed him during his meditation, as it would break his concentration. Leonhardt nodded in agreement and later reported to Remten that Kyle had meditated for an uninterrupted 6 hours. Remten was taken aback by the news. He questioned Leonhardt, half-jokingly, if it had really been 6 hours and not 6 seconds. Leonhardt confirmed it without hesitation. Sitting in the parlor, Remten found it hard to believe. His mind drifted back to when Kyle was younger. Remten had personally tried to teach Kyle swordsmanship, hoping that as a Celturian, Kyle would follow the path of a swordsman growing strong enough to overcome his Hermebu affliction. But Kyle had struggled through the training, often collapsing in tears, complaining that his legs felt twisted and weak. Remten had been furious back then. He recalled how he had reprimanded Kyle, pushing him to get up and reminding him that no member of the Celturian family had ever shown weakness. Frustrated by Kyle's lack of skill and determination, Remten had given up on the idea of his son ever becoming a swordsman. Yet now, Kyle had managed to meditate for 6 straight hours, a fact that left Remten thoroughly baffled. He asked Leonhardt whether Kyle had been hit on the head or if it was even possible for someone to change so drastically, so quickly. Leonhardt quickly assured him that he had checked everything thoroughly, even going so far as to inspect Kyle's meals, and had found nothing out of the ordinary. He confessed that Kyle had, in fact, been acting differently recently, not just in his behavior but also in the way he regarded others, especially Leonhardt. It was clear that something within Kyle had shifted. Remten sat in silence for a moment, contemplating the possibility that his son had truly matured. And if that were the case, he thought, then perhaps it was for the best. He instructed Leonhardt to continue keeping a close watch on Kyle, to which Leonhardt agreed without hesitation. In his room, Kyle focused on absorbing mana from the air around him. As the energy accumulated in his hands, he carefully channeled it into his body, enhancing his sensing abilities. With his heightened awareness, he could evaluate his body's condition and track the exact flow of mana inside him. He decided to take a bold step to try and open the blocked mana pathways leading to his heart. Guiding the mana up his arm, it traveled across his shoulder, down his spine, and finally reached his heart. The pain was intense, causing him to clench his jaw, but the relief that followed was undeniable as the system notified him that the path to his heart had been successfully cleared. The blocked pathways trait began to weaken. For the first time, Kyle felt mana flowing smoothly throughout his entire body. Overjoyed, Kyle realized he had succeeded in drawing an external mana and opening the channels to his heart. This breakthrough signaled that he could now use magic. Determined, he tightened his fists, ready to begin his real journey in magic training. In this world, magic users needed to create a magic circle near their heart to harness their power. The higher the magic level, the more circles a mage had to form. Since forming these circles was time-consuming, most started learning magic early, around ages 5 to 8. By the time they reached 12, they were expected to have created their first circle to be considered competent. By that standard, Kyle at 13 was slightly behind, but that was before, when he was merely a typical NPC. Now, as he looked at his status screen, Kyle understood that his circumstances had changed dramatically. With his special talent mana pathways and the mana channels to his heart finally opened, he was now in the right condition to learn magic. All he needed to do was form his first circle. He thought about how to proceed and considered trying the method he had used in the game. A knock on the door interrupted his thoughts. It was Leonhardt. He informed Kyle that his father had lifted the confinement order. Kyle was surprised but happy at the news. Leonhardt explained that there was a condition: Kyle must be accompanied by him at all times, and while he could now leave his room and explore the garden, he was still forbidden from leaving the estate. Excited, Kyle eagerly agreed, seeing access to the garden as a good first step. He silently acknowledged that Leonhardt must have spoken on his behalf to his father, further confirming that recruiting Leonhardt had been a smart move. However, Kyle noticed that his favorability with Leonhardt had increased by 30 points. Puzzled, he wondered what he had done to earn such a boost in favor. He then recalled that when he had initially resisted hostility, Leonhardt's favorability had been at -50. Kyle speculated if perhaps Leonhardt had been moved by seeing him meditate through the night, and reflecting on how drained he had felt after 6 hours of meditation, he wondered if Leonhardt was the type who admired physical effort and dedication, like one would in sports. Kyle turned to Leonhardt and said it was the perfect time because there was somewhere they needed to go. When Leonhardt asked where, Kyle simply replied that Leonhardt would find out soon enough. When they arrived at the librarian froze upon seeing Kyle. She greeted him but immediately questioned how he was even allowed inside, quickly turning to Leonhardt for an explanation. She reminded them both that Kyle had been banned from the library. Leonhardt calmly informed her that Remton had lifted the ban, which only deepened her shock. Tears began to form in her eyes as she vividly recalled the time Kyle had tossed books onto the floor and ripped them to shreds. She had desperately begged him not to destroy the rare books she had painstakingly collected from various corners of the Empire. But Kyle had coldly dismissed her pleas, stating that they were just pieces of paper and that she wouldn't be reading them when she was dead anyway. He had torn them apart and walked away, leaving her in tears. She reminded Leonhardt that after that incident, Kyle had been permanently barred from entering the library. Sensing his growing frustration as he listened to the librarian's account, Kyle cleared his throat to break the tension and capture their attention. He calmly stated that he was there to read and inquired if they had any books on magic. Leonhardt and the librarian exchanged puzzled looks before the librarian hesitantly explained that they only had basic introductory books since the Duke's family had always prioritized swordsmanship over magic. Kyle merely shrugged, saying that would be enough, and asked for a book that detailed how to create a magic circle. A little later, Kyle found himself reading about mana, a force that creates all things, a form of supernatural energy. The book also referenced that supernatural energy was a term coined by the scholar Joshua Alangrang, relating to the story of his birth. Growing increasingly annoyed, Kyle wondered if this was really an introductory book, and why it seemed so unnecessarily complicated. Exhausted, he lay back, questioning if a 7-year-old could even understand this material, thinking it resembled a college thesis more than an entry-level book. He pondered whether he really had to read it all, wishing for the ease of the game, where a status window would pop up and knowledge would be absorbed automatically. Suddenly, to his surprise, the system window activated, showing that his insight skill had been triggered. Astonished, Kyle watched as the skill began translating the text of the introductory book. As the translation process continued, a loading bar appeared, progressing toward 100%. When the bar was full, the book's contents had been successfully translated. Both shocked and elated, Kyle realized that his insight skill could function as a translation tool. Kyle, excited by the realization that his insight skill could decode even complex books, decided there was no reason to stay in the library any longer. He called out to the librarian Alice and asked her to bring him more introductory books on creating magic circles, informing her that he intended to borrow all of them. Back in his room, Leonhardt placed the pile of books on the table, informing Kyle that these were the last ones. He had managed to gather every book Kyle had requested. Kyle nodded approvingly, commending Leonhardt for how swiftly he had retrieved them. Eager to dive in, Kyle quickly started flipping through the books at an impressive pace. Noticing this, Leonhardt questioned whether Kyle was sure about borrowing so many at once. Confused, Kyle glanced up and asked what Leonhardt meant. Leonhardt explained that the librarian Alice had been very anxious and had pleaded with him to ensure the books were returned safely. These were rare, irreplaceable volumes, ones that couldn't be replaced even if she sold all her possessions. Kyle, finding this amusing, assured Leonhardt that there was no need for concern. Confidently, he stated that he would finish them all in no time. With a playful grin, he jokingly asked if they were worried he might set the books on fire. Leonhardt, recalling Kyle's previous disdain for reading, couldn't help but wonder aloud what had sparked such a sudden shift. His curiosity deepened as he noticed the titles, focused on mana control and the fundamentals of magic circle creation. Surprised, Leonhardt reminded Kyle of his Hermemu disease, which blocked the mana pathways in his body, preventing mana or aura from flowing. Before Leonhardt could finish his sentence, Kyle interrupted, stating that learning magic would indeed be difficult for him and asking if that's what Leonhardt was about to say. Apologizing for his bluntness, Leonhardt backed down. However, Kyle assured him that he understood. He admitted that everyone in the family likely thought the same way, that his efforts probably seemed strange to them. This confession startled Leonhardt. Kyle continued, explaining that as the outcast youngest son, no one would be surprised if he behaved oddly once or twice more. He added that reading books didn't harm anyone, and he understood why Leonhardt was worried, afraid that yet another failure could push Kyle deeper into despair. Placing the book back down on the bed, Leonhardt told Kyle that he'd be waiting outside if Kyle needed anything. Caught off guard, Kyle stammered his thanks. Leonhardt chuckled softly as he exited the room, leaving Kyle behind to ponder whether his newfound love for reading had triggered the change in Leonhardt's opinion. He questioned why no shift had occurred while they were in the library. Didn't Leonhardt admire perseverance? Kyle surmised that perhaps devouring so many books at once had somehow translated as determination in Leonhardt's eyes. Meanwhile, outside the room, Leonhardt walked away with a faint smile on his lips, still processing the surprising turn of events. Once Leonhardt was out of view, Kyle let out a breath of relief. Finally, he was alone with just the books before him. He sat down, ready to immerse himself in his studies, and activated his insight skill. Instantly, the text in the books began to unravel at an incredible speed. He marveled at how the skill allowed him to process information far faster than normal reading, even the most difficult sections becoming clear as data. Soon, the system notified him that the principles of magic circle creation had been successfully converted into usable knowledge, filling him with eager anticipation for the next step. Kyle realized that his understanding had grown significantly, and all the books had been fully decoded. Thrilled by how efficiently the process went, he clicked on the section about circle formation to advance to the next phase, actually creating the magic circle using the knowledge he had just gained. The system confirmed that he had mastered the necessary principles and was now ready to form his first magic circle. Gazing at the glowing golden path that appeared before him, Kyle understood that by guiding the mana along this path, he could complete the circle and direct it toward his heart. With determination, he commanded the energy to flow into his body. As the golden path entered him, the data from the books swirled around him like a whirlwind of knowledge. The system indicated that his mana was successfully following the path. Inside, he felt a sharp, searing pain in his chest, as if his heart were being set aflame. But Kyle knew that if he didn't endure the pain, the mana could backfire, potentially causing serious harm to his organs. Despite the agony, the magic circle slowly began to form within his heart. Gritting his teeth, Kyle reminded himself to hold on just a little longer. The golden path began to fade, leaving a partially formed magic circle in its wake, but the pain was reaching its peak. Kyle mentally screamed at himself to stay strong for just a few more moments. And then, at last, the golden path disappeared entirely, leaving behind a fully formed magic circle in his heart. As the pain subsided, Kyle opened his eyes, wondering if he had been successful. The system confirmed it. He had completed the creation of his first magic circle. His previously blocked mana channels were now fully open, and the flow of mana had strengthened within him. Overjoyed, Kyle leaped to his feet, shouting with excitement. But his victory was short-lived, as a sudden wave of dizziness washed over him. Glancing out the window, he saw that dawn had already arrived. He had been up all night, and the exhaustion hit him hard, causing him to collapse into unconsciousness. Kyle thought briefly about how Leonhardt and Arshil would surely scold him for this. Then, his body gave way, and he crumpled to the floor. Not long after, Ursiel entered the room carrying his breakfast. The sight of Kyle sprawled on the ground amidst scattered books sent her into a panic. She rushed over to him, her voice filled with concern, demanding to know why he was lying there and what had happened to the books. In a single night, Kyle had used up all his accumulated mana to create his first magic circle. A new chapter in Kyle Seltirian's life as an official mage had begun. Alice, upon seeing the disarray of the books, was horrified, but Leonhardt tried to reassure her, pointing out that at least none of the books had been damaged. A few days later, Ursiel was in the kitchen, preparing another meal for Kyle. As she worked, she smiled to herself, remembering how Kyle had complimented the last dish she made, calling it just as delicious as he'd hoped it would be. Her smile grew as she carefully picked up the tray, ready to deliver the food to Kyle. However, just as she was about to leave, two maids blocked her path. One of them eyed the tray and asked if it was for Kyle. Ursiel confirmed it with a nod. The bolder of the two, Hai, stepped forward and offered to take the meal to Kyle instead, telling Ursiel she should take a break. Puzzled, Ursiel asked why they were offering to do that so suddenly. Hai reminded her that it had always been Sally's responsibility to serve Kyle and that Ursiel was only filling in temporarily. Sally added that now that Kyle's behavior had improved, they thought it was time to go back to the way things were. Ursiel paused for a moment before calmly stating that she had no desire to hand over the task. If they had any problems with their duties or wanted to switch things up, they could take it up directly with Kyle. Hai, clearly frustrated, yelled at her to stop, but Ursiel ignored her and continued on her way. Just as she was about to leave the kitchen, another maid entered, staring intently at her. The tension in the room was palpable as Hai continued to shout, asking if Ursiel really thought she was something special. Without responding, Ursiel walked out, disregarding the angry looks from the other maids. When she finally arrived at Kyle's room, her mood lightened, and a smile crept across her face as she saw Kyle enjoying the meal she had prepared. She asked him if the food was to his liking and mentioned that she had made a small adjustment to the recipe he'd shown her last time. Kyle complimented her cooking, noting that her skills were improving with each meal. Blushing slightly, Ursiel admitted that she had been practicing every day and had even picked up a few new techniques from the head chef. Kyle acknowledged Ursiel's dedication and hard work. After finishing his meal, he neatly set down his utensils and turned to her with a question about her progress in learning soul magic, causing her to visibly stiffen. He asked her to fetch the introductory book on the subject that he had given her previously, and Ursiel quickly complied. As she handed the book to him, Kyle inquired about how far along she had gotten, to which she nervously admitted she was only halfway through. Upon inspecting the book, Kyle noticed the well-worn pages and detailed notes, proof of how diligently she had been studying. He knew that, given her noble upbringing, her progress wasn't particularly slow. He also recognized that, considering her age, she had the natural talent to gradually improve with time. Nevertheless, Kyle sighed, remarking that at her current pace, she wouldn't make enough progress catching Ursiel off guard. Kyle was aware that time was running out. In just 2 months, the Seltirian family succession ceremony would take place and Adolf II's son was set to stage a coup. The collapse of the family was imminent, and Ursiel would likely perish in the ensuing chaos. Understanding this, Kyle stressed the importance of her becoming stronger before that happened. He advised her to leave the cooking duties to someone else and devote herself entirely to mastering soul magic. He explained that doing so would help her focus, and he assured her that Sally would resume her role as his maid so she needn't worry. Unexpectedly, Ursiel balled her fists and cried out in defiance, catching Kyle off guard. He called her name confused as she trembled, declaring that she would continue to study soul magic while also refining her cooking skills, unwilling to give up on either. With tears streaming down her face, she pleaded with him not to assign anyone else to take care of him, begging to keep her role. Her heartfelt, tearful plea left Kyle momentarily speechless, and in that silence, he gained a deeper understanding. Ursiel had lost everything when her family's status crumbled. Once the daughter of a baron, she had been sold into slavery and was now working as a maid. She had lost all contact with her family and didn't even know if they were still alive. Naturally, this made her feel insecure, and now that she had finally begun to adjust to her new life and find some sense of stability, Kyle had suddenly asked her to shift her focus to learning soul magic. It was no wonder she was confused. Her duties as a maid had given her a sense of purpose and safety which had become more important to her than pursuing magic studies. Kyle realized that Ursiel was likely afraid that if she didn't do her job well, she could be thrown out of the estate. He knew it was his fault for not explaining things properly. In a gentle tone, he reminded her of what he had said when he first brought her to the estate, reassuring her that she was under his protection. He promised that he would never abandon those who were under his care and that he would always support them. Ursiel, surprised by his words, stopped crying and looked up at him, visibly taken aback. Kyle calmly explained that his request for her to focus on learning soul magic wasn't without reason. He acknowledged that she was an excellent maid, her cooking was exceptional, and her work ethic was unmatched. If she continued on this path, she could easily become the head maid. However, he gently pointed out that there were plenty of other maids in the estate, and any one of them could take over her current duties. Overcome with panic, Ursiel called out Kyle's name, but he calmly approached, gently resting a reassuring hand on her shoulder. In a soothing voice, he asked her to imagine what life would be like as a soul mage. He explained that soul mages were incredibly rare and deeply respected across the world. Kyle assured her that as a soul mage, she could become extraordinary, the most powerful soul mage ever, admired by all and truly irreplaceable. Then he asked her how she felt about that, adding that it sounded amazing, didn't it? Ursiel, still unsure, hesitated before nervously questioning whether she was capable of achieving something so grand. Without a second thought, Kyle reassured her, confidently asserting that she absolutely could. He handed her the book again, reaffirming that she had the potential to become the greatest soul mage and that he had complete confidence in her abilities. Filled with encouragement and joy, Ursiel clutched the book close to her chest, vowing to give it her all because she trusted him. As she held the book tightly, the system flashed, notifying Kyle that her affection level for him had increased to 60. Surprised by her determination, Kyle was overjoyed, offering further words of encouragement, pleased with the growing connection between them. He then officially appointed Ursiel as his personal maid, assigning her most of his private duties so that she could focus on her studies without distraction. To help her, Kyle arranged for her to move out of the shared maid quarters and gave her a private room. When he showed her the room, Ursiel was visibly shocked. Kyle knew that this setup would not only allow her to study more effectively but also ensure his own security. Additionally, it would help avoid any further issues with the other maids. Ursiel expressed her happiness with the room, especially because it was located so close to Kyle's quarters, which made him pause for a moment. Curious, he asked if that was really her favorite part of the room, to which she happily confirmed it was. With an unusual sense of sincerity, Kyle told Ursiel that they should work hard together, ensuring they both survive, no matter what challenges come their way. Later, while Ursiel was at the library, she noticed movement outside the window. Glancing out, she spotted Kyle walking alongside Leonhardt. Kyle waved at her, and though momentarily surprised, she smiled warmly in response. The system flashed once more, indicating that her affection for Kyle had increased to 65. Meanwhile, at the main estate, a maid approached Adolf Selterian, the second son, with her report. After hearing her out, Adolf smirked and questioned whether it was true that Kyle had undergone a change. The maid confirmed it, explaining that Kyle had been dedicating himself to physical training and spending a lot of time studying magic. His attitude had also improved, he no longer lashed out at the servants. Adolf was surprised by the notion that his once foolish younger brother seemed to be maturing. With a malicious laugh, he commented that it was time for him to pay Kyle a visit. At the annex, after waving to Ursiel, Kyle proceeded alongside Leonhardt. He instructed Leonhardt to lead him to a secluded laboratory, a spacious but hidden location. Curious, Leonhardt inquired about Kyle's plans, to which Kyle calmly replied that he intended to perform a magic experiment. Leonhardt, puzzled, asked for further clarification, but Kyle remained vague. Shortly after, they reached the farthest point of the estate. Leonhardt observed the area, noting how isolated it was, surrounded by thick trees and far from the main house. Kyle nodded approvingly and told Leonhardt to make sure no one came near. Leonhardt complied, leaning against a tree and keeping a watchful eye. He couldn't shake the thought that, given Kyle's condition with her maybe disease, mastering magic or swordsmanship should have been impossible. Yet, this new side of Kyle gave Leonhardt hope that maybe it was achievable. Focusing his mana, Kyle formed a glowing orb in his hand and released it as a magical projectile. The orb shot toward a tree, punching straight through it. Both Kyle and Leonhardt were stunned as the tree cracked and crashed to the ground with a loud thud. Alarmed, Kyle asked if the noise had reached the estate, but Leonhardt quickly reassured him that he had dampened the sound with his aura, preventing it from traveling. Relieved, Kyle commended Leonhardt for his quick thinking. Still in disbelief, Leonhardt asked how long Kyle had been able to use magic. Kyle casually explained that it hadn't been long, and that he had followed the instructions from a book he'd borrowed from the library, and surprisingly it worked. Leonhardt's shock deepened, and he asked if this meant Kyle had overcome the Hermobiu disease. With a confident smile, Kyle confirmed, summoning another small burst of magic from his hand as proof. Leonhardt, recalling Kyle's earlier determination to avoid an early death, realized that everything now made sense. Smiling, he congratulated Kyle on conquering his illness. The system promptly informed Kyle that Leonhardt's affinity toward him had risen by 10 points, making Kyle realize just how patient the knight had been with him. Leonhardt then explained that the spell Kyle had used, Magic Bullet, was usually a basic first circle spell, about as powerful as a punch from a grown man. However, the destruction of the tree suggested Kyle's spell had far exceeded that level. Kyle agreed, adding that the power he had unleashed felt more like a fourth circle spell, even though he was still classified as a first circle mage. He assured Leonhardt that despite his current rank, he had somehow managed to channel the strength of a much higher-level spell. Amazed, Leonhardt remarked how extraordinary this was. Kyle admitted he hadn't expected such intensity either, which led Leonhardt to consider that Kyle might be far more gifted than he initially thought. Kyle remarked that the power he was wielding seemed far too noticeable, though he couldn't deny how thankful he was for his natural abilities. He thought back to how his insight skill had enabled him to read through all the first circle magic books in the library. Without that ability, it would have taken him months to create just one magic circle. Yet, one question continued to bother him: why was the spellcasting method deciphered by his insight so different from the process in the game? According to the books, casting a spell required drawing a complicated magic circle, performing calculations, and then channeling mana to activate it, a method that felt outdated. In contrast, the game's approach was much simpler. Players only needed to trace a basic sigil using mana, and the spell would activate immediately. It was faster, easier, and much more powerful. Determined to see if the method from the game would work, Kyle decided to cast magic using the simplified approach. However, the resulting power was far more intense than he had anticipated. He quickly realized this could be a problem, as it wasn't yet the right time to reveal his full abilities. Kyle turned to Leonhardt and asked if he could keep what had just happened a secret. Surprised, Leonhardt asked if that meant he shouldn't even tell Kyle's father. With a slight grin, Kyle confirmed and made a light-hearted comment about keeping it just between them. Almost immediately, the system notified Kyle that Leonhardt's affinity for him had dropped, leaving Kyle both shocked and confused. He couldn't believe he had lost points over something so minor, and he started to question if his joking tone had somehow offended Leonhardt. Feeling somewhat embarrassed, Kyle quickly clarified that he had a legitimate reason for keeping his true power hidden. He wasn't ready for others to know the full extent of his abilities, at least not yet. Leonhardt, still trying to grasp the situation, asked why Kyle wanted to conceal his strength. Kyle explained that it was related to the upcoming succession ceremony in 2 months. This seemed to catch Leonhardt off guard, and Kyle asked if he was familiar with the event. The Salterian family succession ceremony was a long-standing tradition designed to determine the next family head, not based on age but on skill and merit. The candidates were judged on various factors, including their personality, swordsmanship, intellect, knowledge, public backing, and the opinions of the family's most trusted servants. The goal was to choose the most qualified individual to lead the family to even greater heights. At the moment, 2 strong contenders were competing for the position of heir. The first was the eldest son, Abel Salterian, and the second was the middle son, Adolf Salterian. Abel, the eldest son from the Marquis's first wife, was the favored candidate. He was known for his kind nature and impressive swordsmanship. From a young age, Abel had been trained to take on the role of heir, carrying the family's high expectations, and was supported by the house's most trusted and loyal servants. Adolf, also a child of the first wife, had spent much of his life in the shadow of his older brother, Abel, often overlooked. However, as he matured, Adolf's personality became more composed, and his swordsmanship improved at an impressive pace, finally allowing him to stand out. His main supporters were young, ambitious knights, which helped Adolf gain a reputation as a strong and capable leader. During a tense exchange, Adolf stomped his foot in frustration, accusing Abel of ignoring him. Abel, seemingly preoccupied, responded by saying he hadn't even noticed Adolf approaching. Unimpressed, Adolf pointed out that Abel had been using his aura since he was just 5 years old, which made it impossible for him not to sense someone nearby. Abel waved it off, calling it a childhood stroke of luck, and suggested it wasn't something worth bragging about. He advised Adolf not to bring it up, lest others mock him. An elder standing next to Abel interjected, mentioning that Adolf hadn't shown any signs of an aura until he was 15. He added that his own son had been the same, which had made him worry about his child's lack of potential. With a calm smile, Abel remarked that some people develop later but advance quickly once they get past the initial barriers, subtly encouraging Adolf. One of Adolf's knights, enraged by the remark, shouted at the elder, demanding to know if he had a death wish. Adolf immediately stepped in, ordering his knights to stand down, reminding them that they were inside the main estate, where their father resided, and such reckless behavior was unacceptable. The knights quickly apologized, struggling to control their anger. Abel watched his brother for a moment before commending him, saying that Adolf had trained his men well and was indeed a serious contender for the Marquis's title. Adolf, with a smile, warned Abel to enjoy his laughter while it lasted, because it wouldn't be for much longer. He then commanded his knights to leave, walking away as Abel gazed after him, deep in thought. This is the end. Please comment Kyle below if you want to do next part.